So welcome to the SUSE Linux Enterprise server session on SAP. My name is Christian Holsing. I'm based in Waldorf, Germany with SAP. I joined pretty recently, coming from IBM, 17 years with IBM. I'm going to walk you through the SAP content for today. This is obviously one of many sessions we're going to do on the relationship we have from SUSE with SAP. What we're going to cover is just a brief overview of what SLES for SAP applications is. Then we spent a bit of time on support changes that we introduced at the end of last year. I just want to take the time to explain that. I had a little bit of feedback over the last weeks that we haven't clearly communicated, so I just want to get that straight. Then we're going to talk about upgrade path from SLES 11, 12 to 15. The configuration and tuning tools that we have, recent updates in that space. A few words about NVDimm / Intel Optane. There's also a session from Intel on that topic. If you haven't heard about it, this is quite interesting for SAP HANA customers. Quick update on workload memory protection, high availability, a data hub, and then we wrap up the session with the direction we're going to take for the product in the next year and 2 years. So that's where we want to go. Basically, and I'm just coming out of a bunch of analyst meetings, so luckily I'm not falling off the stage here, so because there is none, but if I'm just breaking down, then that's part of coming right out of it. But I think the market acknowledges it, and for those of you who have been in the partner session yesterday, we are by far the market leader for Linux workloads in the SAP space. Right? We have a long-standing relationship. SAP HANA is actually compiled and developed on SLES. We have enabled a whole lot of products. We have a long-standing relationship working with SAP. Again, the majority of customers run on SLES. The market share is about 90% for Linux-based workloads in average. And for SLES for SAP, we provide an integrated support with SAP Premium Support 24/7. That just comes directly with the product, and you see the number of references and also customers. So again, by far the most used distribution. When we're looking at SLES for SAP application and how it's built up, it obviously is based on the SUSE Linux Enterprise server as its foundation. We have, as part of the product, SAP-specific update channels where we ship our SAP-specific packages that we bring to market. Then we have the whole section of high availability with the high availability extension, the cluster connector for SAP, the HANA high availability scenarios that we ship as part of SLES for SAP only. Then we have a section of additional components, container runtime. You will see why I bring this up, but it's obviously relatively easy to add the container extensions to SLES for SAP and have container-based workloads running on top of an existing SLES for SAP installation. I'm not talking Kubernetes, just to draw that line there, but it's, again, very simple to just get the container-based workloads enabled. There is a HANA performance pack as part of the product. SUSE Connect is something that we have in the product for a while. It basically allows partner to provide specific solution packages and an easy way for a customer through a YAST module to integrate external repositories and install additional components on top of your SLES for SAP system. There is some work that we're just doing, just to mention this right now, to re-energize SUSE Connect as an easy way to integrate third-party repositories without going through the command line and doing the key handling manually. and broaden that a little bit for other areas of the portfolio. But that's work in progress, so I just want to mention it here as an intro. And we will certainly put blog posts up when we're ready to talk more about it. Then, it's interesting, we're hearing Queen in the background. Not bad. It couldn't be more epic. Then we have SPOS, Enhanced Service Pack Overlap Support. I'm going to talk about this on the support changes in more depth. There is a white paper on SAP hardening. If you have security concerns, there is a guideline how you harden the Linux server, turn the services that you don't need off to provide maximum security. We continue to provide the YASC modules for SAP for configuring and for installing the systems. And we have virtualization consistency, which means no matter which virtualization technology you put SLES for SAP on, you run it consistently. Right? And everything is wrapped into priority support. As I said before, 24/7 support provided through SAP, so there's one channel for our customers to go to and open a ticket with both SAP and SUSE, and we handle that in the background and get this to our support if necessary. This was a discussion that we had in the past over and over again in terms of we certify SLES for HANA workloads, and we have SLES for SAP, and there are differences in it. So it's both supported from an SAP side to do so. So you see both NetWeaver and HANA workloads are certified on both plain SLES and SLES for SAP. But where you see the first big difference is that the HA scenarios, all high availability scenarios, are only supported in SLES for SAP based on the operating system. Right? So if you decide to use other technologies, you can do that, but there is a clear distinction here. The performance tuning that we're talking about, there is a generic tool in SLES, which is SAP config. Saptune is basically only available in SLES for SAP, which does performance tuning based on the SAP workload you put on the system. So there are differences between the tuning for HANA and the NetWeaver system. Right? That also applies to the SAP-specific tooling, so SLES doesn't have that. But SLES for SAP brings workload memory protection, the HANA firewall, and these kind of tools with. From a support perspective, SLES provides standard support. So there was a discussion last week for development systems. If that's good enough, you're not going HA. SLES is probably a good starting point. But if you move into production, you probably want priority support, especially as you do upgrades on the SAP side over the weekend. And if you get stuck and have to wait before you can open the ticket, that's probably not a sustainable way to operate your business systems. Then there is the support duration, which is different. You see there is LTSS, long-term support for SLES, and there is no LTSS anymore, but we cover that in the next section. And also the way how you open tickets going through SUSE or going through SAP, there is a distinction. So just as a reminder, we certify both flavors of our operating systems. But if you want to move into production, there are some advantages going with SLES for SAP. From a deployment options perspective, I think you've seen this slide before, and that goes back to my virtualization consistency. We support the three major buckets of deploying on-premise, virtualized, and bare metal for x86, and Power for HANA, and for NetWeaver workloads, System Z is also supported. We also have a bunch of public cloud images that we update with the latest developments for AWS, Azure, Google Platform, Alibaba. They're just there. You can go to the marketplace, deploy the images. For Azure and others, there's the opportunity to go through bring your own subscription. and with that, move workloads over to the cloud. And obviously, there is also the discussion about private clouds. Can I go with OpenStack and other platforms that's also consistently supported for SLES for SAP and the workloads? And just as a reminder, because people were complaining about this, live patching, just to talk about this, Neil Barnett is doing a session. We support live patching for the kernel on SLES for SAP. It's an additional subscription. But if you want to just make sure that the kernel is updated, live patching since SLES 12 is also supported for SAP workloads. So respective fixes with the severity levels, you can just apply to the kernel without any reboot. Really. So you can do it in the live system, and you don't have downtimes, especially if you think about HANA and very large HANA instances, the time it takes to rebuild the database. That's probably quite an interesting feature to do live patching. And just to advertise Neil's session, there is also work now going on to go to key operating system libraries and also include them into live patching. So we're at a starting point. Neil will have more details, but that's an interesting area to go deeper into and see if we can extend that over time to more libraries and potentially also to SAP systems themselves. Okay. Talking about the support changes briefly. So what we have announced in December or in November and what became effective in December is that we are going to support every service pack of SLES for SAP from 12 onwards for 4.5 years with a standard subscription. Okay, that was different before. It was 2.5 years with a standard subscription, plus the opportunity for our customers to purchase LTSS at an additional charge and get 2 additional years of support. And we decided to just streamline that. There is 4.5 years of support now included in the standard subscription, and it should give you as customers and partners more flexibility to stay on a given release, and there is no forcing function to update unless you're running out of support after 4.5 years, or SAP is relying on a specific version of a library that we're not backporting and they haven't certified, for example, HANA on an older service pack. Okay, but in general, there is the 4.5 years of support that we provide, and again, effective since December last year. If you look at the lifecycle page, you basically see no changes for SLES 11, and you will understand on the next chart why there was no change on SLES 11, which is effectively out of support since 2 days now, out of general support for SP4, and customers who have SLES 11 SP4 in production and need support would need to go the LTSS route until 2022, or to the point when they decide to do upgrades. There is one particular case that I just want to mention here, which is IBM Power Big Endian. Right? So if you rely on IBM Power Big Endian, run HANA 1, then that's only supported on SLES 11 SP4 at this point. There is no Big Endian support for SLES 12. No certification. And if you are on this release and you decide to move forward, we have worked with IBM. There are offerings on the e-configurator of IBM to go through the IBM tooling to purchase LTSS. There is also a specific bundle that we have created with IBM that's available either through IBM or the SUSE channel if you need more support, longer support for SLES 11 SP4. So I just wanted to mention it. That also applies for Intel-based workloads. If you don't want to upgrade, you can reach out to your partner or SUSE rep to purchase LTSS and receive ongoing support. For SLES 12, we basically made a change, and you see something that was confusing in the beginning, because you still see there is 1.5 years of support, and the SPOS ends at after there's 1.5 years of support until general support ends, and 4.5 years until SPOS ends. The reason for that is that basically SPOS is, from the support terms, similar to LTSS. So you can go and look up on the SUSE page. During the LTSS, we're not providing new features in general, and there are a few other limitations. That's why we introduced this, that there is 1.5 years of full support with new features and everything like on SLES, and then SPOS equals, from the terms and conditions, LTSS, and we continue and move forward. The SPOS date for SP4 on 12 isn't defined yet, because we haven't shipped SP5, which we will do. And as this is enhanced service pack overlay support, the clock starts ticking when we ship SP5, right? So that's why there is a TBD. And it's the same is true for SLES 15 here. So we basically know 4.5 years, and that will be adjusted when we ship SP1. So from an overview perspective, basically you see there is full support, which is 12 months of general support plus 6 months of service pack overlap support. Both are fully supported, are in the full support conditions, and then there is 36 months of SPOS support for every service pack available, again with the standard subscription. There is one exception for the last service pack of a release, where basically you still see LTSS being displayed. If the general code stream goes out of support for SLES, then the support for SLES for SAP ends, and there is then the opportunity to purchase LTSS, because again, we're talking about service pack overlap support. If there is no other service pack, there is no overlap. Makes sense. Okay. So that's the support changes that we've introduced. The general message is 4.5 years with a standard subscription, no LTSS needed until except it's the last service pack of a given release, and at the moment it looks like SP5 will be the last one for 12, but it hasn't been finally decided. Okay, upgrade path. We've spoken about SLE 11, SP4, and if we just leave HANA 1 aside and Big Endian for the moment, there is an opportunity to go through an ISO image upgrade from 11 to 15, which is basically an offline upgrade. So you could do an in-place upgrade if you decide to not replace the hardware. For the regular service packs, you can just do the online upgrade, and at the end of SLE 12, in this case it's SP4, SP5 is getting there, the same applies. There's also one notion that I had a few discussions about. We do have OpenSUSE in place, which is our free distribution without subscription, and there's a documented way if you want to upgrade from LEAP 15 to SLE 15, how to do that. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that for SAP workloads, but just for general reference, we wanted to highlight that. Again, documentation is linked here in the slides. Okay, talking about configuration and the tooling around it. In general, there are 3 ways for customers to implement SAP nodes or specific recommended tuning options. I assume most people in the room know what an SAP node is, which is basically the recommendation of settings that SAP publishes through their support system. And as I said before, we do have tooling as part of SLES for SAP that implements the nodes in the system. sapconf is the one that's generically available for SLES and for SLES for SAP. Saptune is the one that is available as part of SLES for SAP. That's agnostic to the workload you're trying to put on the system. And obviously, there is also the way to do manual configuration or use your own tooling. A best practice, which is an obvious best practice, is just use one tool and not all three at the same time. That's making troubleshooting very hard or keeps you very busy. I mean, whatever you prefer in that way. But that's actually one discussion that we're having internally with the product teams and the Linux Lab in Waldorf to basically look after these two tools and make sure that we're not overwriting changes with brute force and they getting acknowledged to each other, and we have some form of control in place that these tools are not competing. That's one step, and a future consideration that we're having is actually also consolidating these two tools and basically associate it to the subscription that you're having for the system in terms of how much functionality you get out of it. But then it would just be one tool and not multiple tools anymore. So talking about sapconf for a moment, as I said before. There's a question? Sorry, thanks, Michael.
If you build a new SLES 15 and you pick that you want to do a SAP application, is it going to pick one of those for you, or do you have to tell it which one you want?
You have to choose which one you want and enable it, yeah. So the question was, does the system pick one of these tools for you, or do you have to decide on your own, and you have to decide on your own which tool you want? Okay, SAP Conf, as I said before, not agnostic to workloads. We did a major rework in 2018 of the tool, implementing a new set of parameters and making them configurable. So on these two file locations, you can basically start going in and make your own changes. The blog post is, the two blog posts are referenced here, and again, that's available since SLES 12 SP1. Saptune, the tool that comes with SLES for SAP, implements, besides the general nodes, also nodes that SAP recommends for HANA or for NetWeaver workloads. And as a hardware partner or as a hosting partner, there's also here a configurable way to basically put override parameters in a distinct directory, so that that if you have experience that some of the recommendations SAP is giving, you want to fine-tune, you're able to do this. Just build your RPM, for example, put it on the server, and have the tool acknowledge that.
Find any note for Saptune for tuning, or is it being updated?
It's being updated. So what we're doing right now is we are working on an update of Saptune. So that's work underway. That should come out in the next couple of weeks and months. For those of you who are present in the Linux Lab, we already had some discussion and offered it to hardware partners in Waldorf to basically get a pre-version, testing it, giving us feedback on nodes that should be implemented there. So, you know, as you heard, we're the open source company, and we just want to give you the opportunity to get into the process early and take a look at it. So that's all coming. It's under active development right now, and a beta version is internally available. Just reach out to us on it.
Is Saptune using the TuneD profiles that are in there, like the SAP-HANA or SAP-NetWeaver and stuff like that? Is that what it's
I think it does at the moment, yeah. So that's also, you know, we're taking a broader look at the tooling at the moment, but that's what it is at this point, right? It's TuneD based, and we go from there. And again, back to the question, there is also an update on the nodes and some cleanup going on right now to just get a new updated version of Saptune out that makes it easier. There is also some broad thinking at the moment to see if there is a way to interface with the SAP support system and automate it to some way, but that's somewhere in the future. It's not something that's coming in this release. Right? I'd rather get the new version of Saptune out quickly instead of making it a broad, big exercise and you have to wait for it, another release. That doesn't make sense. So it will be an iterative process, and you will see updates coming out on the channel on Saptune. Okay, NVDimms and Intel Optane DC. So I would encourage you, there is a session on this technology here at SUSECON. So if you think of HANA workloads, and I assume most people here in the room are very familiar with HANA workloads, but we're talking about terabytes of data that's in memory, right? And if you think about that for a moment, one of the key problems of that is that the memory, the DIMMs in the machine is not persistent, which means if you have to restart HANA, if you have to reboot the server, which obviously never happens, but from time to time you just have to do it because of patches or whatever, it just takes time to load data from disk and process it and get it back into memory. So there has been a lot of work going on when I joined SUSE last year in this area. Intel has basically worked on Intel Optane technology, which is persistent memory. Okay, again, there is a talk to it. What persistent memory means is that even on the reboot of your server, your HANA database stays in memory. Okay, which means if you think about a couple of terabytes that are just there and that you don't need to read from disk, that really speeds up the reboot of the machine, right? And Fabian is going to do a clustering session, right? And the systems are clustered, we have scale-outs and so on, that's all there. But if you think about it from an operational perspective, from a data center perspective, if you can shorten the time it takes to get the cluster, system in the cluster back into the cluster and fully operational, that limits your risk as a service provider or as the IT department for another outage. Right? Because if you have a 2-server cluster, you're basically running a higher risk if that server also goes down. It's a mathematical, simple thing. And I think that's really why Intel Optane is a very interesting technology in the space of SAP HANA, that you can basically restart the server much faster, restart HANA much faster, it's back online much faster, and part of the cluster again. Two things that I just want to get straight. NVDimms are supported for HANA for column store only. So the column store of HANA moves onto NVDimm. There is still a requirement for DRAM on the machine. So it's a mixed environment. So row store and the query engine still uses DRAM. And when we started with the first POCs, the supported configuration from SAP was 15 terabytes, 12 terabytes of NVDimms, of Optane, and 3 terabytes of DRAM. But in the meantime, the last thing I've seen was a 8-socket machine with 36 terabytes on it in a POC, so it's growing rapidly. Right? And if you just think about how long it takes to read 36 terabytes from disk, even if you have fast SSDs, that's just a while. Right? So that's clearly where you see the benefit of it. And the other thing is, we still see disks in these machines because the server is still writing the HANA logs to disk at this point. So you don't see fully diskless machines. But what I would expect is that the write cycles are becoming longer and longer over time, and at some point, because theoretically you could also use NVDimms as a file system, I assume we will also at some point really see diskless machines, but we're not there yet. From a support perspective, HANA 2 revision 35 basically supports NVDimm on the SAP side, and from a SUSE side, SLES 12 SP4 and SLES 15 GA has all the required kernel drivers in there. And we're still working on enhancing that and speeding things up. So it's quite an interesting partnership for, and quite an interesting project for me as we work very, very closely with Intel and SAP to come to this point. So it was really three parties. No, at this point it's not. So the question was, is it possible to have the server without DRAM? At this point it's not, because it's required for the row store. Yeah, and thank you, Jörg. Yeah, okay. There's some blogging from the SAP side, and obviously I would just use this as a rough guideline, and I think the blog also only says this is not a reboot, but a restart of the HANA system. But you see there's a significant improvement in terms of the startup time, and the other thing is that the newest Intel CPUs will also support more memory per CPU. So you will see more and more memory being associated to the systems. Right. Okay, I've spoken about these configurations. So the slides are public for everybody who's taking pictures. If you have something to complain, just tell me later. Okay. Workload memory protection. In SLES 12, we had a specific functionality that was an extension to the kernel, preventing the kernel, especially in backup cases, to start swapping HANA pages to disk. Right? If you were doing backups and you were starting to copy pages, the kernel at some point was coming to the conclusion that he needed to free up memory, that memory needed to be freed up, and you start to swap an in-memory database to disk, which is kind of weird if you're thinking about it in a memory database and you're starting to write it back to disk. With SLES 15, we decided to change the technology and implement it more on a standard and more adapted technology, which is C groups. And that's another project that we're running at this point, basically putting the HANA processes into a respective C group and have the C group handle the protection of the memory. So that's work on the way. The tricky part here is that it's obviously a whole bunch of processes. And if you look at how an SAP system is started, there is the launcher and all different processes are getting triggered from there with different process IDs. So it's not that easy to catch everything. But again, that's work underway that we're looking into at this point. And from a technical perspective, C groups version 2 is being used. With systemd and so on. So again, we're underway. We're going to blog about it as soon as that's available and part of the product. Okay, high availability. Just touching on this, there is a session from my two colleagues, Fabian and Bernd, going into way more detail. Just from a high-level perspective, there are basically two types of high availability scenarios that we see. One is like a traffic light, so that was hard for me to understand that this was a traffic light in the beginning, but if you think about it, the traffic light consists of multiple LEDs. If a couple of those are malfunctional, it doesn't really matter. So you have internal redundancy within the system. But there is also the opportunity of an external takeover where you basically have a standby system and a coach saying, look, this soccer player or whatever your favorite sports is injured, doesn't work properly anymore, and I just do a swap and get a new fresh player in there. And if we would be in an ideal world in soccer, this person would be rebooted and healthy again. We're not there yet. Right, so who knows what's going to happen in a few years. Anyway, in IT, that's basically what happens here on the HANA side. The system recognizes the server is malfunctional, it's getting fenced, it's been moved out of the cluster, and a new server is taking over that position and is handling the workloads. So from a HANA perspective, high availability, we support multiple scenarios here. It's just starting on the very simple scenarios with 2 HANA servers, could be multi-tenant. One is the master node, one is the passive node, and in case of failure of node A, pacemaker monitors it, fences the node, which is very important to ensure consistency of your data so that there are no additional transactions being written over to the system. The IP of the cluster, the virtual IP, travels over to the second node, and the replication of the HANA database basically switches direction as they switch after a reboot their role. Then there is a second supported scenario where I basically have the same one as before with a QA database under the passive node. So I can do some QA testing. In this environment, then we're starting to talk about scale out of the systems, getting multiple HANA servers into the cluster. That's also fully supported and documented. There is the SUSE cluster connector that we provide as part of SLES for SAP, where you can basically from within an SAP Management Console, if you're not a Linux administrator but an SAP administrator, within the SAP Management Console you can see the health of your cluster and basically the same information that the Linux admin would see. So that even from a SAP Management Console you're able to trigger takeover and schedule these commands. And then there is support for various cloud providers, which is sort of a little tricky from time to time, as Pacemaker relies on on-premise deployment on block devices to store the health status, and not all, every CSP has this kind of block devices, so there are different descriptions of how to set up high availability that we're blogging about, that we provide in the documentation. Just to name one, there is on the Azure documentation a whole section of how to set it up, how to replace the block device, and basically do the setup. One of the things that we're trying to do in general is put automation in place here, right? And we are at a point that we're able to deploy a HANA HA cluster in the labs on Azure automatically. You just set up the configuration. And I think I brought the video, so just stop by at the booth and we can talk about that in more detail, and I can show you how to do some of this. And the same is being duplicated over to AWS and other cloud providers, so we just have to start somewhere, right? But automation is obviously a key thing, as I guess part of the reason why customers, especially if you think about quick workloads, test and demo systems, the thing that people want is really going on the cockpit and just say, I want a HANA system, click one button, there it is, set up, and I can use it, instead of spending weeks and days on getting the system set up, configured before you can actually use it, right? I think that's part of the Kubernetes beauty, that as a developer you can just get a container, throw it on the system, have it up and running, right? And then all of these things come together in the larger scale-out environment where I'm basically starting to split workloads, have a standby HANA server that takes over workloads and so on. Again, it's all documented. I'm stealing a little bit of the thunder from Bernd and Fabian, but they will show you a demo of it because if we are looking at S/4HANA, not everything is the HANA database itself. There is still application server involved in it. With a central instance and the replication server and basically the two app servers. And what we just achieved certification on and what became possible with a new high availability API that SAP introduced called Enza 2 is basically a rolling kernel update for SAP. So we're not talking Linux kernels here, but in this environment, and again, you will see this in the demo that the two guys are showing, we're basically able to upgrade the central instance, the replication server, and then the two dialog servers without any outage, really. So you just trigger a script, and the update of the whole SAP kernel, the patching, just happens without outage automatically. And again, that's being certified from SAP. And you see here that the big new thing with Enza 2 is that basically the replication changes and the central instance moves over, so it's much easier, and there was quite a bit of work that has been done in this space. And there are also enhancements on the integration of the SAP Management Console, which means that you can basically now also move for example, the central instance to a different server. This is a 4-node cluster, and you can basically just from within the management console, as I said before, as an SAP administrator, without going to the command line, move an SAP system around in the cluster and move the replication server to a different node, or so on. Again, there will be a good demo, and Fabian and Bernd will be much deeper onto this, as they've basically written a lot of this. And there is new control functions that we've built into the cluster connector that are also available now with the new version.
I have a question.
Sure.
This is run from the command line or the SAP Studio for the new SAP functions. So it's not built into like CRM or HA from the OS side, specific to the SAP side?
It basically uses the OS functionality that we ship. So it's basically going to the cluster connector and the HA functionality that we ship with SLES for SAP. Right? But the trick that happens here, and that's why I made the Enza 2 reference, is that that before restarting the system was very complicated with the replication server moving around. And with Enza 2, that has significantly changed from an API perspective, and that makes this possible now.
So, just so I can wrap my head around it, before, when you want to do a replication or a failover, you'd have to go to the cluster, say, hey, can you put this in maintenance mode, fail this guy over, and then do all this work manually. Now with this, from the SAP console or from the SAP command line, it'll do the same functionality?
Correct. It will do the same thing, and we'll just put the cluster in maintenance mode, do this for every node, and just quickly do a restart and so on. But it's literally seconds, no outage really.
That just involves less supporting external customers.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's why I just wanted to highlight this, because it makes things a lot easier, right? Okay, good. Data Hub. Few words on Data Hub, and I think there is also a session on Data Hub here. The big message is you hear us talking about CASP, Kubernetes, containers all the time, and SAP is is also doing a lot of work on this, and I don't want to feature a data hub as a product. It's basically a way to integrate different data sources into an SAP system, and the trick is the governance around it. From an operating system perspective, what's really interesting is that Data Hub fully ships as containers. Okay, that's a huge difference to the previous systems that you've seen, where you basically install a HANA or a NetWeaver system or an application server outside of a container. Data Hub basically is, to my knowledge, at least one of the very first products that SAP is now shipping as a container-only solution. So there is an own Docker registry that SAP provides as part of the product. There are Helm charts and so on. There is also a reference architecture. The first one that is public is coming from Lenovo, so you can Google for that. And there is the reference architecture of how to set Data Hub up on CASP and SUSE storage. I know that HPE and Fujitsu are also working on reference architectures, so there is a lot of things coming. But again, the point that I really want to highlight here is that there is a shift in workloads happening on the SAP side, and it's broader than just Data Hub. So I was at the TechEd event in Barcelona last year, and when you listen to the SAP executives, there was one thing that they repeated over and over again, which was keep the core clean. You know, which means put your extensions, if you can, not on top of the application server, the ABAP stack, but if it makes sense, put them into a container. That's what Leonardo, Fiori, and a lot of these things start to enable, that you can basically put an extension. There was a nice demo of an onboarding process, which is for most companies something that you don't need constantly running as an application, but you have like a few people a week that you onboard, and they showed a demo of here's an extension that I just have in a container. It's being instantiated. If I need it, it communicates with an SAP backend, retrieves data from there, writes it back. As soon as the process is done, the container goes away. All right, so there's really a lot of emphasis from the SAP side on containers, and I would also encourage you to take a look at SAP Gardener. Dirk from the Gardener team is down in the developer zone, and that's a project that SAP will put open source, which is a quite interesting intellectual challenge because it's a Kubernetes cluster in a Kubernetes cluster. Sounds a little strange, but I mean, if you think about it for a moment and you make the assumption that there is development on the SAP side happening in containers, then as a developer, you need a system to test it, and it's a pretty complex thing. Usually, we're not talking about a system that has like 3 containers that you can just do on the command line with Docker. So take a look at Gardener. It's something that, to my knowledge, is going to the community very, very, very quickly, and that basically automates this. As a developer, you just go in and say, I want to test my code. I need a Kubernetes cluster. I click the button. Here it is, and technically, it runs in a Kubernetes cluster. So quite interesting. Data Hub, just so you've seen it from an architectural perspective, that's basically the architectural point of view. It's a number of roughly 10 different containers that make up Data Hub in the just plain mode. It obviously breathes on the different containers. Interestingly, and we'll figure this out very quickly, one of these containers is HANA. It's used not as a terabyte database, but it's basically used as a sort of a cache to store data in transaction. There's interesting developments happening, and you can also connect it out to, as I said before, different systems, not only SAP systems, but also Hadoop. There is third-party tools and open source tools that you can just integrate. So it's really meant to open up the SAP system and connect it to different backend systems. So from a SUSE perspective, that's obviously quite interesting because we do have CASP, and as I said before, the reference architectures that we've seen are using CASP as the runtime for the containers. So there is an opportunity here for us from a SUSE perspective, and we're working very, very closely on-site with SAP to drive this topic. This SLES for SAP reference here is more really a reference to remind you there is the container runtimes available on SLES for SAP. We had a discussion 2 weeks ago if there would be an opportunity to run Data Hub on a single server, and it really isn't. So you will need for Data Hub Kubernetes, but if you want to get started with containers, try things out. Potentially, if SAP is starting to provide smaller tools as containers, which I expect is going to happen, you would be able to just run them on SLES for SAP as well. Without a full Kubernetes environment, but technically that works. And there's also obviously from a SUSE perspective, and I heard that in the analyst meetings before as well, the container also needs sort of an OS without the kernel itself. And the question is, do you want to move for these kind of workloads, for these enterprise workloads with an unsupported system, or do you want to move with something that is supported? Right? So we'll see where that goes. But in general, just wanted to mention that thought. Okay, which brings us to the future directions. Where do we want to go? For me, I basically have 3 big buckets in mind of where I want to further advance and invest into for SLES for SAP. The first one is the operational enhancement, right? I mean, I think we're all happy, and I personally also have a life as an administrator before I went into product management. And I was happy when my system was stable. And I think that's just the core business what we need to focus on. We need to make sure that the configurations are stable, that the systems are stable, that we have features like live patching and so on available to you, which minimizes the amount of reboots, just making sure that the system really is rock solid, and you minimize basically the calls you get from the IT operation asking you, can you reboot the system, please, in the middle of the night. I think we all had that if we are in administration. So definitely that's one area, and the other one I briefly spoke about. We are at a point where we see automation becoming more and more prime time, and we definitely want to invest there. And as I said before, we're doing this for public clouds already, and it's a small step taking this also forward into on-premise deployments or virtualized deployments. Right. So those areas are really, really key. Then there's the second bucket of new technologies, which is basically new hardware developments like Intel Optane. Right? That's something that I believe will make a huge difference in SAP workloads, and we see what's going to happen. I assume there is Optane 2.0 already in discussion. So that will move forward, and there will be new features, new opportunities here that we definitely want to enable. There are other hardware partners that I've heard of that are not Intel-based that look into some things. We'll see what's happening. And container-based workloads, same thing. What I said before, SAP is moving to containers. We want to be part of that. We want to work with SAP and continue driving this relationship with SAP. There's a lot of trust, and I'm talking about that on the next slide. But really, we want to drive that forward and be on the forefront there from a SUSE perspective. And then that was hard for me starting in this job as a newbie. from the outside, looking at the different toolings, and here's a tool for this, here's a tool for that. They are conflicting, it's not cleaned up. So there's also some work that we want to do in consolidating basically the tooling, simplifying it, and remove the need to explain things. And also looking at the fact, can we modularize components in a smart way, basically break them into different things, going back to what I said before. On the cloud workloads, the block devices are always somewhat different. The rest is the same. Doesn't it make sense to think into direction to say, I just isolate this component of the block device, and dependent on where I run, I just pull the respective code in. So that's kind of discussions, which is also from a software maintenance perspective, makes a whole lot of sense, because I don't have 10 varieties of the same script, I just have one. Right. So this is really where we want to look into, where we're starting to look into right now. So SP5, SP1, the planning is going on. A lot of these things are on the short list to go into the product there. And as I said, Saptune is also manifesting already. There is a beta version available, and so on. Closing this off, we have a good team on site with SAP on a day-to-day basis in the so-called SAP Linux Lab. So these guys, and again, a few of those are here. Fabian is here, Dirk is here, Markus is here, and Bernd is here. Grab these guys, we're really on site. I'm also trying to be on site as the PM a few days a week and really interacting with SAP. And if you are at SAP in St. Leon Roth, it's building 22. So if you want to stop by, literally every Linux partner is in this environment, and it's a good place to be. And talking about the Linux Lab, that's actually having its 20th anniversary this year. So that's how long the story is already going. And if you remember the first chart that we had, SUSE is part of this pretty much from the beginning. We were one of the founding members of the Linux Lab, and we're going this journey with SAP, and we want to continue working with SAP, driving Linux into the SAP workloads. And obviously, as a customer, if I have to migrate my HANA environment to a Linux-based operating system, wouldn't it make sense to potentially also think about the application servers and other servers to move over to Linux to have one holistic environment? Right, so there is a mission for us, and we try to make that happen. So there's a set of references and links, and we have 1 minute 30 for Q&A. Yes?
Are you guys looking at ways that you can control the SLES for SAP repos so that somebody can break their environment by doing an update from the SLES for SAP repo?
Have you, so it's a question if we're looking at ways to control the repos for SLES for SAP so that somebody cannot break their system, which means you have broken your system. I want to hear that case and just make sure that if we have a problem, we get this filed, because that shouldn't happen. It's not tumbleweed.
I'm just curious, from your point of view, you've been there a year, and from a project management perspective, do you guys use Agile or Kanban, or what kind of methodologies are there?
So from a methodology perspective, we're just moving the team to Agile in the SAP space, right? And as I said, I joined from IBM, we were Agile, and I mean, I do believe in it. I don't believe that Agile is the only thing to do software development. Depends on what you are doing. Right, but for Saptune, for example, I mean, you heard that they were saying we have a beta version and so on. We want feedback early on, right? And it doesn't make sense for us to sit in the lab and looking at stuff and, then release something that...
Yeah. I think one thing actually that we struggle with is that at what point do you release to the customer? Like, don't you want to find most of the bugs here, internal, before releasing something, and then all of a sudden.
So, I mean, officially we released with the beta candidates to customers, right? So at that point, you can look at it, the beta releases of SP5. And just my reference, I need to make my boss happy. I killed my tumbleweed system last week, but ButterFS saved my life. And we're going to blog about this because I think there is a lot of resistance for people, and we heard that from Germany, to adopt ButterFS. But what happened is that the same thing that you just referenced, because the update failed. And I was looking at the system, and at some point my boss just said, why don't you just go back? You have ButterFS, right? And I reverted to a snapshot, rebooted the system, and was back up again, right? So that. From that perspective, if you think about enterprise workloads, right, the case that you described that I definitely want to understand, that shouldn't happen. If it happens, ButterFS and the snapshot capability there is really good, because at that point you can just go to a snapshot that was working, and you have a stable system instead of sitting there troubleshooting the whole thing, which is to some extent also the idea of DevOps, moving things through a pipeline, retesting it, and having a stable environment before you bring it back into production. Okay, so we're here, we're down on the show floor. If you have further questions, come and see us. There are good people from the Linux Lab, and we can go deep technical there as well. Thank you for your attention.